We've talked a lot about patterns, what to expect when you're reading old literature, like genres, rhyme schemes, topoi or commonplaces, meter, inverted syntax. Today we're going to look at the figures of rhetoric. They're called colors sometimes. They're called the flowers of rhetoric. Hence the phrase when you hear people say that a passage of poetry or writing uses flowery language. Flowery language implies that the language is filled with flowers. In other words, it's filled with the flowers of rhetoric or the figures of rhetoric. Now, the figures of rhetoric are a way to enhance your language, to kind of dress up plain speech. Your plain old natural English is not enough for poetry, so you need to use these colors to give it some pizzazz. And to do this, there are a variety of prescribed ways or rules that came from the Greeks and the Romans. We've already seen a few. Readers and audiences of this period love these figures. In thinking about Shakespeare, at least a portion of the audience understood the tropes and figures when they heard them. Otherwise, they would not appear in such abundance in the play. And to hear them, one had to pay attention to what was happening on stage. Moreover, they found in them a peculiar delight that somehow escapes us. For one thing, they loved ornament for its own sake, and the figures were something separate from plot, character, and spectacle for them to applaud. I also want you to be delighted for the figure's own sake. Now, for the Renaissance period, language had to be playful. It had to be dignified. It had to match or enhance the ideas of a poem or a play. And the poets are very conscious of these figures. In Shakespeare's Sonnet 98, for example, he plays with the figures associated with springtime. And you remember what springtime is. That's the old medieval Roman topos of the locus amoenis, which links spring with bird singing, bird songs, and flowers. In other words, the poetic use of language. Nor yet the lays of birds, nor the sweet smell of different flowers. He's talking about those particular features associated with love poetry. They were but sweet, but figures of delight. There's even a critique about his rival poets. Yet when they have devised, what strained touches rhetoric can lend. You can understand why these figures are so seductive.
I must confess, but that thou overheardest ere I was ware, my true love passion, therefore pardon me, and not impute this yielding to light love, which the dark night hath so discovered.
Lady, by yonder blessed moon I vow, that tips with silver all these fruit tree tops.
Oh, swear not by the moon, the inconsistent moon, the monthly changes in her circled orb, lest that thy love prove likewise variable.
What shall I swear by?
Do not swear at all.
You can hear them, right? But can you identify them? Like meter, you could hear it, but you really couldn't hear it. And once you learned to scan and saw that rhythm, you were finally able to accustom your ear to hearing that rhythm. The same thing has to do with figures. Now, let me tell you a quick story, and it relates to this. I was driving out in the desert once. We were on our way to Louisiana and we hit Arizona, and we'd been going through the desert. It was so boring, right? It was the same brown, bushy plants over and over and over again. And then we got to the border of Arizona, get some gas, and they had a postcard rack. And we picked up, for fun, we picked up this postcard. So while I'm driving, my wife had the card in her hand and pointing out the plants as we were passing by. Then suddenly this monotonous drive became completely vivid. We could recognize ocotillos, chollas, as well as creosote and palo verde, and the desert became alive. This is the same case with old poetry. For it to be alive, it helps for you to understand what you're hearing and what you're seeing. And so access to the ornamental figures, the figures that Renaissance writers like Shakespeare used, are important. So let's enter the garden of poetry. And that's the locus amoenis, isn't it? We can hear the birds, we see the beautiful flowers, and learn to identify these flowers of rhetoric. I'm only going to show you a few of my favorites. If you want to learn more about them, then just go to the book that Shakespeare used. It's Puttenham's book. You get to book 3 on ornaments, you start to see all of the figures showing up, all the figure examples, all the figures that Shakespeare used. The easiest figures are the figures of repetition. There are also figures of thought, but let's do the figures of repetition. The easiest figures are the figures of repetition. First, repetitions inside the line. Ploche is what Puttenham calls a repetition of a word with a space in between. Civil and civil, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. Puttenham calls this the doubler. Cankered with peace to part your cankered hate. Cankered and cankered. Sometimes repetitions are based on the word's root. We call that polyptoton. Here's an example of ploche and polyptoton together. With Tybalt slander, Tybalt that an hour. You can see that the apostrophe S. Traductio is when you repeat a word or a word's root, in other words, polyptoton, throughout a passage. Fee, fee, thou shamest thy shape, thy love, thy wit, which like a user aboundest in all, and usest none in that true use indeed, which should bedeck thy shape, thy love, thy wit. Thy noble shape is but a form of wax, digressing from the valor of a man. Thy dear love sworn but hollow perjury, killing that love which thou hast vowed to cherish, thy wit, that ornament to shape and love, misshapen, that's polyptoton, in the conduct of them both. There are also figures of repetition that are set or structured in particular places along the line. For example, take epinalepsis, when the line begins and ends with the same word, repetition. Puttenham calls this the echo sound. I will not budge for no man's pleasure, I. There's also repetition inside the line where 2 words repeat one right after the other. Puttenham calls this the cuckoo spell because it sounds like a cuckoo clock. And what I spake it to my face. Cuckoo, cuckoo, I spake. And this is a famous one. Good night, parting is such sweet sorrow. And you also Romeo, Romeo. There are also some figures that organize repetition along the edges of the lines. So the first one is the most famous. It's anaphor, that repeats a word or phrase at the beginning of 2 or more lines. Her traces of the smallest spider web, her collars of the moonshine's watery beams, her whip of cricket bones, the lash of film, her wagoner of a small grey-coated gnat. Puttenham calls this the figure of report. It's supposed to sound, a report is a gunshot, so it's supposed to sound like a gunshot. And madly pluck with my forefather's joints, and pluck the mangled Tybalt from his shroud, and in this rage with some great kinsman's bone. There's also repetition at the end of the lines. Puttenham calls this the counterturn, and its Greek name is antistrophe or epistrophe. I bring thee tidings of the prince's doom. What less than doomsday is the prince's doom? Now, this can only happen in blank verse. Blank verse, remember, is iambic pentameter without rhymes. That tends to be the metrical system used by Shakespeare in the plays. However, if it's in a sonnet or any other rhymed poem, then we call it rime equivoque, the rhyming of similar sounding words. For example, look at this. When Mercutio starts to sing an old hare whore and an old hare whore, that whore is a rhyme because it's a popular song. That's rhyme equivoque. That is not antistrophe, because antistrophe is the repetition of a word. Rime equivoque is the rhyming of a word. That sounds. There's also one of my favorites. It's called anadiplosis. This is where a word or phrase at the end of a line gets picked up at the beginning of the next line. Wednesday is tomorrow. tomorrow night, look that thou lie alone. Puttenham calls this the redouble. Not all figures are going to be strict. Some are going to be kind of loose, like for example, just above it, hold on then, go home and be merry, give consent to marry Paris. And that's also with another figure, antimetable, which is kind of a punning. Here's another kind of loose one. You can always find these figures are going to be kind of loose. Hence banished is banished from the world, and world's exile is death. The reverse is called antimetable. You're going to have to forgive me for this one. It switches pages on this version I got. Beguiled, divorced, wronged, spited, slain, most detestable death by thee beguiled. Finally, to end this brief introduction to the figures, remember there's more. There's figures of repetition, there's figures of thought. Go to Puttenham's book. There is chiasmus, where repetitions create a kind of cross or X. It can happen across several lines. Remember, the figures can be loose and the figures can also use polyptoton. So in this case, but wherefore, villain, dost thou kill my cousin? That villain cousin that would have killed my husband. And you can see, if you do this right, it makes an X. Or it can be flattened along one line. But one poor one, I'll circle it, one poor and loving child. If you kind of make it work, it's kind of like a weird X. It's a flattened X. So that's your postcard for the flowers or colors of rhetoric. The garden, I hope, at least when you're reading Renaissance literature, won't just be a blur of color.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.
When this is the flower, you see, this is dye. This is sample, this is dye.
What is this flower called?
No, let me see.
It'll come.
Coming more bush.
Oh, that's
more
amazing.
Full and more flower. This is Duranta. No, Duranta.
We'll have to look it up in a book.
No, yeah, I know the name. But this is Viola and this is expensive. Dianthus, yeah.
That's what it's called?
Yeah, Dianthus. Es que dice confuso con Duranta. Duranta. But this is Dianthus.